Dr. Nzimande says the looting and the burning of infrastructure in July after the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma was indeed an insurrection. Dr. Nzimande's views come after several ANC members and ministers contradicted one another on whether the unrest was an insurrection or not. The outspoken SACP General Secretary says the plotters of the failed insurrection worked with criminal networks and mobilized along racial lines.
The debate on whether events that followed the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma were an insurrection or not continues to rage. SACP General Secretary Nzimande is not mincing his words and has placed the insurrection attempts at the doorstep of ANC factions.
The dangerous insurrectionary conspiracy emerged from its nesting place within the ANC itself. There have been mixed messages and debates about the nature of the July events. Insurrection then. Insurrection, that's what it is. Were they a planned insurrection or the work of mafia-style criminal gangs or an opportunistic mass looting spree, as if what happened did not involve all of these dimensions? It was part of all these dimensions.
ANC National Chairperson Gwede Mantashe says the vulnerable state of poor South Africans was used in an attempt to settle political scores.
Whenever conditions of our people are used to orchestrate nefarious agendas, we should be able to stand up against such agendas.
Dr. Nzimande further alleges that the insurrection plotters wanted to halt economic activity in order to bring the country to its knees.
This insurrectionary violence and turmoil of early July was both planned and promised, sometimes brazenly by those behind it. It was at once well-funded, relatively professional, but hopelessly inept strategically. The plotters deliberately triggered and then lost control over a wave of mass looting, mostly by the most marginalized strata in our society. But shopping malls were not the prime target of the conspiracy itself. The real target was to cripple major transport arteries, and particularly the key South and Southern African N3 corridor, to block the Durban harbour, to strangle Gauteng, and to take out electricity, oil pipelines, communications infrastructure, and the burning of food depots.
Small businesses, mostly belonging to black people, were gutted when malls were looted and burnt. Dr. Nzimande says the attack on these businesses made the plotters to lose ground support in their failed coup attempt.
Instead of winning popular sympathy for their political objectives, the insurrectionary plotters, who themselves had been involved in high-level, globalized looting on an industrial scale for a decade and more, quickly found themselves on the back foot in the face of a massive and countrywide popular groundswell.
The SACP, celebrating its centenary, has called on South Africans not to allow themselves to be racially divided. It's also called on law enforcement agencies to arrest thugs and criminals in Phoenix who killed black people. Samkele Masego, SABC News, Johannesburg.
And to discuss the significance of the milestone for the party, we're now joined by the SACP Central Committee Member for Media, Dr. Mashilo. Dr. Mashilo, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Good evening to you and to the viewers at home and those who are using mobile devices.
Indeed, it's an absolute pleasure having you join us this evening, Dr. Mashilo. First of all, before we reflect on the SACP centenary, it would seem that the party is now entering the fray with regards to, the debate whether the recent violence was indeed an insurrection. So what informed the SACP's decision, or rather position, on this?
Firstly, we need to understand what the term insurrection refers to. That refers to violent uprising against an authority or the government. That is indeed what happened. And as the General Secretary said, the primary targets for the violent uprising that we saw were not necessarily the malls. The primary targets were to stranglehold the economy by destroying connections from the southern arteries connecting Gauteng province, by blocking the Gauteng economic activity, linked with the transportation networks from KwaZulu-Natal. We have seen that as part of what has happened, there were major activities involving arson directed at factories. Pharmaceutical products were banned. Pharmacies were banned. There were just so many attacks. And this clearly was directed at the government. And let us not forget that before this happened, there was violent mobilization for this to happen. Little did many know that behind the violent mobilization that was so explicit, there was planning for this violent uprising against the government to take place.
Now, Dr. Mashilo, the centenary celebration obviously is an opportune moment for the SACP to just look back, to make a valid assessment and to reflect on the SACP itself. And I want to refer you to the statement that one of the SACP leaders, Joe Slovo, upon the unbanning of the SACP in South Africa, when he asked the question, has socialism failed? Now, the SACP being one of the key proponents of socialism and communism, I suppose it is prudent that we start interrogating whether socialism has indeed failed.
Firstly, let us start where we are in South Africa. What has failed in this country is not socialism, but capitalism. The South African economy is a capitalist economy. The high levels of unemployment, poverty, inequality, the uneven development that you see when you travel throughout the country, the inequalities that you see that are articulated along racial lines, along gender lines, which are basically class inequalities, are not the failures of socialism, but the failures of capitalism. When Slovo wrote the pamphlet, Has Socialism Failed?, he was reflecting on what happened in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And what we saw happen thereafter is that instead of the ideas of socialism collapsing with what has happened in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in countries like South Africa, we saw those ideas garnering momentum. And the failure of capitalism in these countries has further strengthened the ideas and the struggle for socialism.
When you say the failure of capitalism, but it suffices to mention, Dr. Mashilo, that South Africa is largely a capitalist society, and the SACP, being the proponent of communism and socialism, is in bed with the party, with the very party that supports, capitalist policies.
The ANC did not invent capitalism in South Africa. The 100 years that we were celebrating today of the SACP shows you that capitalism was brought in South Africa fresh from the box through expansion from Europe and imposed. That was the beginning of the capitalist failures that you see. The reason why we are in an alliance with the African continent, with the African National Congress, is that we are both independent formations. Each one of us advances their views. We expect the ANC to open itself to be persuaded by the Communist Party in as much as the ANC expect us to open ourselves to be persuaded by its arguments. What unites the Communist Party and the ANC are our shared strategic objectives, and this we express through a national democratic revolution. The ANC found South Africa in the state of a mess. If you do not recognize the major advances that the government led by the ANC made since 1994, and indeed some of them will not be allowed in an ordinary capitalist society, you will not appreciate the progress that we have made. So the SACP is not the ANC, and the ANC is not the SACP. That's why the two independent formations are in an alliance with each other based on common objectives.
And speaking of such common objectives and strategic objectives that are binding the SACP and the ANC, it suffices to mention that the SACP has played a much more influential role than most communist parties on the African continent. So could this be attributed to the party's successful integration of its intellectual and ideological perspectives into the African National Congress liberation strategy?
The strategy was actually discussed in the mid-1920s. It was a world strategy of the communist movement discussed at the international, by the Communist International. What has distinguished the SACP from the other parties is the economic situation in South Africa. When you look at South Africa, as the ANC said in 1969, in this country, we have a largely developed working class in the form of wage laborers, or what in one word is referred to as the proletariat. So the ideas of the SACP have been going hand in hand with the development of the working class in this country. The SACP has had the advantage of the proletariat who understand what exploitation is to embrace the line of march. That is one of the factors that made the ideas of socialism among the working class or in South Africa gain popularity compared to a country that does not have a large base of the wage labor movement.
So, Dr. Mashilo, has a study been conducted with regards to the link between communism and, the economic strength of a particular country? One case in point is superpower China, and the fact that China is largely a communist society, and it is the global superpower. So, can that ideology be used in other settings, such as the African setting, for instance?
One of the things that we discuss among each other as communist parties, and this is very old, it dates back to the year 1848. Our national conditions and circumstances are not the same. Our historical situations are not the same. While we follow the same ideological line, be Marxism, Leninism, we implement and develop that line based on the historical conditions prevailing in our own countries. That is the context in which China, following the path that it follows, characterized their program as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And in our situation, we believe in a national democratic revolution. We believe that deepening the national democratic revolution and strengthening it with socialist-oriented measures will drive it to the right direction, an indispensable advance towards a socialist transition.
But generally, where does the communism stand today, Dr. Mashilo?
Communism was a response to the barbarism of capitalism. That is where it stands today. It is a revolutionary movement to achieve universal social emancipation. It is a movement that is against a powerful system, a powerful exploitative system that is able to win people ideologically and otherwise, but it is a movement that is an undying movement. We are continuing the struggle, taking the struggle forward to those who started it before us 100 years ago when they established the Communist Party of South Africa in 1921 July.
When you say that communism is a response to the barbarism caused by capitalism, I mean, one then wonders then if indeed this is an exercise in futility, because in capitalist societies, such as in South Africa, there's a great deal of inequality. Capitalists continue to exploit the proletariat and enriching themselves at the expense of the proletariat. So where does communism there feature in terms of trying to, quell this particular narrative?
Remember that communism is a democratic movement. Capitalism in South Africa was established as a result of colonial expansion from Europe. It was established and maintained and in fact heightened by the apartheid regime. Those were capitalist formation. What did communism do in South Africa? Communism overthrew the apartheid regime and achieved a transition to our current democratic dispensation, or at least that was a contribution of the South African Communist Party as part of our broader national liberation movement. This democracy we have today is a milestone achieved by the struggle for socialism in South Africa, working hand in hand with other revolutionaries, primarily the ANC and progressive trade unions. So the struggle did not end in 1994, and the struggle, like Rome, will never achieve its objectives at a stroke. So the struggle continues until such time that we have secured all its goals.
What has the South African Communist Party done to, sell its ideology to the masses, and so that the masses can actually feel that the SACP is doing its best to raise awareness about communism here in South Africa, so that people can strike a resonance and embrace socialist and communist ideals?
I'm sure you are aware that as part of our liberation struggle, the ideas of socialism gained currency in our national liberation movement. They were synonymous with fighting for our democracy. That is the extent to which the Communist Party succeeded to build at least a general understanding of the direction of the struggle. But that will not end with the achievement of this current democratic dispensation. It will not end with the achievement of the massive social progress we realized. The capitalist system is still strong, as you have said, and the struggle continues, which is why we are continuing with massive political education, our connections with working class formation, and we know that for socialism to succeed, it has to be democratic. And for it to be democratic, it has to be based on democratic engagement and democratic advancement until such time that it is wildly hegemonic towards achieving a transition from the capitalist formation.
All right, Dr. Alex Mashilo, great chatting to you, sir. Thank you so much for helping us reflect on the SACP's centenary anniversary celebration.
Thank you very much.
That was Dr. Alex Mashilo. He's the head of media and the spokesperson for the South African Communist Party, and he's been reflecting on the SACP's centenary anniversary and whether communism is still relevant in modern-day South Africa. This is The Globe on SABC News. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment.